Well, welcome everyone. Well, we still have people joining us, and thank you for hopping on this chilly day. I'm Jennifer Johung, Director of the Center for 21st Century Studies at UW Milwaukee. I'm really pleased to introduce the UW System Faculty Lecture Series and our speaker today, Derek Handley. I also want to thank my lecture series co-organizer, Russ Castronovo, director of UW-Madison's Center for the Humanities, and his team in Madison, and also C21's managing director, Katie Waddell. This series of lectures highlights faculty research from across the universities of Wisconsin, and today we're excited to have Derek Handley with us. Derek G. Handley is an assistant professor in the English department, affiliated faculty in the African and African Diaspora Studies Department, and affiliated faculty in the Urban Studies program at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. He is director of the Mapping Racism and Resistance in Milwaukee County project, which comprehensively maps racial covenants and uncovers Black resistance to such discrimination. Derek's book, Struggle for the City, Citizenship and Resistance in the Black Freedom Movement, was just published by Penn State University Press in September. So congrats, Derek. And
Thank
before I
you.
turn it over to you, just one small thing. We'll have time for a Q&A after the lecture, so you can all put your questions in the chat. Okay, Derek, it's all you.
Okay, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and let's make sure that goes okay. How's that look?
Looks good.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Jennifer. I really appreciate being here and that wonderful introduction. Um, I just do want to mention that I am the co-director of the Mapping Racism and Resistance Project alongside my colleague Ann Bonds in the Geography Department. I'm excited to be part of this return of the UW faculty lecture series. And again, I want to thank the Center for 21st Century Studies for inviting me. And not only that, for all the support given to me for this book project, including hosting a book workshop when I was a fellow at the center. Accordingly, there were many scholars, both here at UW Milwaukee and at UW Madison, who provided me feedback on this project. So that we will begin. I want to share my research, which is covered in this book, on how African American residents in Pittsburgh, St. Paul, and Milwaukee organized resistance to urban renewal projects in the 1950s and 1960s, which destroyed their communities' economic centers. First, I'm going to, let me check my slide here. First, I'm going to give you the historical context of urban renewal, its implementation through a master narrative, and how Black communities resisted that narrative, as well as the urban renewal projects themselves. I will begin this presentation with reading from the introduction from the book about the urban renewal events that took place in all three cities in 1956. The bulldozers arrived early in the morning of May 31st, 1956, to 1206 Epiphany Street in the Lower Hill neighborhood of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Nearby residents watched the demolition of the building with the understanding that their homes, businesses, and churches will soon be next to face the wrecking ball. However, some took comfort in the fact that they had been promised new, clean public housing in other parts of the city. Others believed that this public housing would be built on the very acres that were being razed by the bulldozers and wrecking balls. A few months later, on September 20th of the same year, the housing chairman of the branch chapter of the Milwaukee NAACP, Bernard Tolliver, wrote to the national headquarters asking for, quote, any advice in free literature, end quote, on how to open the housing market for Negroes in response to the fast-moving developments of the local urban renewal program. These developments will later include targeting and demolishing the Bronzeville neighborhood, the heart of Milwaukee's African American business community, in order to build the I-43 freeway. In St. Paul, Minnesota, 6 days after Tolliver's letter requesting help, the local police arrived on an unseasonably warm fall day to 449 Rondo Avenue wielding axes and sledgehammers. Inside the house lived Reverend George Davis and his wife, Bertha Miller Davis, who was blind and rarely left their home. The Davis home was one of the many slated to be demolished for the construction of the Interstate 94. But the 80-year-old Davis, who years prior fled from Texas and the Jim Crow South to live in Minnesota, stood in the doorway with a shotgun, refusing to leave his home. The Davis family was one of the last of the 650 families in the Rondo Avenue neighborhood that were displaced by the construction of the interstate, which quote, split the heart of the city's Black community, end quote. These three neighborhoods, these three proud Black communities would never be the same again. These scenes were playing out in many cities across the U.S. during the 50s and 60s. I focus on northern cities because too often they, as well as resistance to urban renewal, often gets overlooked as being part of the beginnings of the civil rights movement. Despite having the ability to vote, African Americans had little representative power in northern city governments in the mid-20th century and lacked traditional civic means to prevent being uprooted from their homes, business, and churches. As James Baldwin stated in 1963, urban renewal more often meant, quote, Negro removal, end quote. The Housing Act of 1954, as well as the Highway Act of 1956, disproportionately affected African Americans living in the urban north. These actions were a direct result of American cities' love affair with urban renewal. Only weeks after the U.S. Supreme Court passed down its verdict of Brown versus Board of Education, President Eisenhower signed into the law the Housing Act of 1954. Although both of these legal milestones will have significant consequences for African Americans in Cold War America, it was the Housing Act of 1954 and the Highway Act of 1956 that drastically altered the living conditions for vast numbers of African Americans across the United States. These acts gave American cities unprecedented power to build arenas, highways, upscale apartment buildings, and shopping areas, which transformed the material layout and appearance of their cities. The mostly white city governments were not interested in improving Black neighborhoods, but rather in tearing them down. Many of these city projects were designed to either keep white families from moving to the suburbs or to encourage white families to return to the city via a freeway for sporting events, shopping, and entertainment. These events suggest much about the widespread but local threat of urban planning policies in African American communities in northern cities, communities that were already restricted as to where they could live. So here's a scene from Milwaukee of a couple standing where their house used to be that was torn down in preparation for the building of the highway. Unfortunately, I don't know the name of that couple, but you can see the devastating effect that it had on the surrounding area. In this photo, we see a more recent location of downtown Pittsburgh. The part that's outlined in yellow is the traditionally Black neighborhood called the Hill District. If you're familiar with any of August Wilson's plays, 9 of his 10 plays are set in the Hill District. And you can see over changing of time, 1939, what the neighborhood looked like. The area that is blocked off in red is referred to as the lower hill. And it's although it was primarily African American, it was still culturally diverse, Syrian residents as well as Jewish residents. And then by 1967, you can see the Civic Arena, which was built. And if you're a fan of hockey, that's where the Pittsburgh Penguins played for a long time. But is for me in this book project, it's those events right before the tearing down of the neighborhood that is the focus of my book project and leads me to some of these research questions. How did the African American community respond to urban renewal when they first heard of the plans? What conversations, deliberations were taking place in the community, in the churches, the barbershops, and hair salons? What kind of spaces for deliberations or forms of civic engagement were created in response to urban renewal, and what was their impact? In doing this research, one thing I discovered was that many African Americans in Pittsburgh, which was one of the first cities to take advantage of the federal program, were not resistant to urban renewal at first. Why is that? Or why was that? So in the book, I talk about the master narrative of urban renewal. The language of the Housing Acts of 1949 and 54, as well as the Highway Act of 56, provided the roots for what I call an urban renewal master narrative, which was used by federal officials and city governments to invoke eminent domain and to remove blight and slums in parts of African American neighborhoods. This master narrative of urban renewal was centered on African Americans. So, because of that, Imani Perry's term racial master narrative is applicable. Racial narratives, quote, garner an accepting audience in part because of their familiarity and in part because of the perception they allow us to make sense of the world, and they are therefore replicated and repeated, end quote. These racial narratives about Black people and blight shaped the way other city residents sought solutions to the city problems. This urban renewal master narrative contains several discursive features that make it effective. Number one, metaphors of sickness and disease. If it's blighted, then of course the blight has to be cut away. Number two, progress towards idealized future. If you look at the image on the left of this slide, this was the original plan for downtown Pittsburgh. Forward-looking, futuristic, if you will. And the third thing, the third feature of master narrative, urban renewal master narrative, is in promoting it, an absence of racial divisions or racial inclusions. So basically, what I'm saying is, as they are promoting this idea of renewal, if you will, renewing the cities, of course, the racial divide is not discussed, but neither is racial inclusion. But once the Black community realized that they were not going to benefit from urban renewal, the response, the organizing, and civic engagement was swift. So in the book, I talk about a feature, a concept, if you will, called Black Rhetorical Citizenship. And in this slide, discusses the theoretical underpinnings of that concept. So my study approaches citizenship as a site of resistance and, quote, a mode of public engagement, end quote. And that comes from Robert Ason's discourse theory of citizenship. For African Americans, citizenship is survival, and thus race must be taken into consideration when examining urban civic engagement. I offer Black rhetorical citizenship as both a concept and a methodology to examine events in the Black freedom movement. Viewing citizenship in this manner allows us to see citizenship not as a specific act, such as voting, but rather as a process that comprise different activities. So I'm also drawing heavily from African American rhetorical theory and thinking about African American rhetoric. As you see in this slide, Karenga says African American rhetoric is, quote, a rhetoric of community, resistance, and possibility. So this is a key feature, especially the rhetoric of community. So taking this approach to my study, in my analytical lens, if you will, I discovered two distinct strategies of resistance. And those are rhetorics of place, which will feature placemaking, counter narratives, and critical memory as argument for urban planning. And the second one, rhetorical leadership, which includes community organizing and how agency is distributed amongst the community, and strategic civic alliances, and critical memory is part of the organizing of the community. So for the purpose of this presentation, I'm just going to focus on the organizing and the strategic civic alliances. I argue that, using archival research, my analysis finds that while residents in these cities had somewhat different rhetorical strategies in response to urban renewal projects, one powerful rhetorical strategy used by residents were to find key allies to partner with. I argue that these partnerships help residents to leverage new forms of authority and technical expertise, as well as create counter-hegemonic spaces for training their own civic leaders. Racialized urban spaces can limit the full exercise of agency because of the systemic, legal, and cultural constraints, but they can also allow for several permeations to engage that system in somewhat tactical ways. These alliances were important in the distribution of agency within African American community in Pittsburgh and Milwaukee. And in St. Paul, one key alliance was instrumental in modifying the plan for the highway. So this first slide begins with an image of Frankie Pace, who was one of the organizers for creating the citizens community for Hill District renewal. And she was also a small business owner in the Hill District of Pittsburgh. So this organization enlisted the help of a young white Carnegie Tech architecture faculty member named Troy West, who had opened an office in the early 1960s in the Hill District. A group of African American artists, including the painter Edwari Ed Ellis and then budding poet and later playwright August Wilson, took West under their wing and showed him the importance and the value of the Hill District to African Americans. With the technical expertise of West, the organization CCHDR developed a three-dimensional architectural model of the Hill District with the purpose of arguing their ideas in oppositions to cities' plans to build an art center. The residents argued that a more community-oriented development for the neighborhood would be better than the proposed art center. An art center was going to be in a location to the right of where we see the civic arena in that model. The residents argued that a more community-oriented development for the neighborhood would be better than the proposed art centers, which only exacerbate the limited housing situation in their neighborhoods where African Americans were most often permitted to live. The model served both as a material and symbolic argument against urban renewal and was a visual depiction of the residents' civic ideas. The city did not respond to the residents' proposal, and none of the changes appeared to have been implemented after their presentation. The then Pittsburgh's urban renewal director, John Morrow, was present for their presentation, but was reported as sitting, quote, without comment, except to say that he and other city planners will discuss and look at the plans and model later, end quote. Here we have a room size map that the residents also developed to continue their argument for a better Hill District. And the residents actually were had hands-on in drawing and putting their ideas into their map for what they thought would be better for their community. The residents exerted agency through the production of the model and map an otherwise hopeless situation against the city and federal machine. Creating their map was an act of rhetorical agency where the residents could express their ideas to the city in a visual manner and increase their ability to have the city hear their desires for the Hill District. I also suggest that enlisting the help of West increase the residents' ethos with the city because of West's status as a Carnegie Tech architecture faculty member. Carnegie Tech is now known as Carnegie Mellon, at a respected educational institution. His models help provide legitimacy to the arguments of the residents to those who lived outside of the Hill District. West and his graduate students were able to provide the technical knowledge to depict the desires of the residents who simply wanted to protect their homes. In St. Paul, Minnesota, January of 1956, the Rondo St. Anthony Improvement Association was formed. Understanding the great task at hand, the residents of Rondo appointed Reverend Floyd Massey, who was the pastor of Pilgrim Baptist Church. His image is in the far right in this picture, and barbershop owner Tim Howard to co-lead the organization. And Tim Howard is second from the left. These two men were already leaders in two important institutions in the Black communities, a barbershop and a church, places where, on a varied scale, African American public deliberation often took place. So I suggest that they implemented a placemaking strategy in order to save their neighborhood. The placemaking strategy include community organizing, civic education on property rights, meetings with government officials, and in some instances, individual protests against forced removal. Rhetorical placemaking was residents drawing from the cultural and spatial history of Rondo to invoke resistance to the actions of state and city government. The association came up with three distinct arguments in response to the proposed highway. Number one, Rondo residents were not in opposition of a highway, but instead wanted more input on how the highway was going to affect their space. In other words, don't build the highway through Rondo. In this image, the blue rectangle there is the Rondo neighborhood, and you see the orange is the highway that goes right through it. But in the early plannings of the highway, there was a proposal for a northern route, which is the green, which of course would have saved the Rondo neighborhood. However, it would have added more time to the commute between St. Paul and Minneapolis. The second strategy is residents wanted to disrupt the borders of racialized spaces so that Black residents could live anywhere in the city through open housing laws. Another response was to challenging the housing discrimination that existed in St. Paul, as well as here in Milwaukee. But the third tactic, if the freeway was going to be built, and if it was going to be built into Rondo, then the goal was to have the highway to be depressed as opposed to being raised. And that argument was made at a public hearing in December of 1956. They recruited the efforts, they recruited George Shepard, the city engineer, to recommend a press design. And here we have an image of they're digging to lower the highway. So one of the things that I'm arguing is that even though they were not able to stop the highway, they did win a small victory in lowering the highway to prevent the nuisance of a large structure going over top of their neighborhood. But not only that, it creates a situation in which today there are efforts to connect both sides of Rondo through a land bridge. So in Milwaukee, residents took another approach in finding key allies. Sometime in early 1964, Lucinda Gordon, the community director of the Milwaukee Urban League, and who had previous leadership roles in the Milwaukee NAACP, contacted the director of continuing education at Marquette University and the University of Milwaukee's Extension Division requesting help in 3 leadership courses for, quote, individuals working in our neighborhood organizations and in civic groups, end quote. So, out of this collaboration with faculty at UW Milwaukee and Marquette, they created what was called the leadership seminars, which were to be offered in 5 weekly sessions between September and October of 1964, and were designed to, quote, foster active participation by African Americans in civic activities in the community. The seminars were part of the Urban League's emerging leadership training for minority groups that were offered to citizens of the Milwaukee area and for the benefit of the whole community. The program was open to minorities who lived in the Milwaukee area for at least 18 months and who were between the ages of 18 and 45. The participants had to be recommended by the Urban League, clergy, youth organizations, schools, etc. According to the proposal for the leadership seminars, they had several goals to serve the city of Milwaukee, including, quote, provide qualified social conscious person who will assume the positions of leadership in the community, and by, quote, helping prepare their participants for a more effective role in community development. Here we see the news release for the seminar, Citizen and Social Action. This leadership seminar directly addressed the policies, plans, and issues surrounding urban renewal and provided strategies for how to address those issues. There were 32 participants in this seminar, and each section was taught or administered by a faculty from UWM or Marquette or a representative from the city. The course content for the first seminar included the following. Number 1, government structure. I got 2 number 1s up on that screen there. Number 2, citizen preparation for involvement in public hearings. And 2 number 3s. Services for the Department of Public Works, ordinance of landlord-tenant responsibilities, community renewal program, and organization for social action. These titles to the lecture suggest that these seminars taught an understanding of city government and the rules and policies regarding information that could prove valuable when challenging specific policies. The course content for the seminars not only provided content information for urban policies and practices, but also provided a guide for actions and behaviors when speaking in public on civic issues. The information provided to the African Americans present in the lectures would allow them to organize and participate in debates regarding their neighborhoods. This space was also served as training ground or a practice area for marginalized rhetorics to develop their rhetorical skills before entering a white majority dominated public sphere. The participants of the seminar could discuss controversial ideas in the class with comfort and with little pressure while improving their rhetorical skills. One of the things that I found interesting when I was doing the research for this part of the project, um, when I saw the folder for leadership seminar, I actually saw a syllabus for a Intro to Speech Communications 101 course, which was helped to use to design the leadership seminar. So out of this seminar, several of the participants went on to form a neighborhood organization called WACO, which stands for Walnut Street Improvement Committee. The mission of WACO was, quote, self-help urban renewal, which included cleaning up empty lots, pressing landlords to better maintain their properties, and buying and rehabilitating homes. Waco was also intent on showing to city officials that the neighborhoods could be rehabilitated with investment. They also worked to offer low income housing for residents. Their accomplishments included painting over 100 buildings in the area and conducting trash removal drives. The mantra for Waco and other neighborhood groups was the same as the leadership seminars. Active participation in your neighborhood is a requirement for citizenship. Waco's accomplishments highlights how establishing relationships with other organizations and individuals outside of the community empowered local African American organizations to gain a sense of control over their own circumstances. In this book, I explore residents' abilities to make their own rhetorical choices and highlights their struggles to acquire expanded civic rights, illuminating in the process the complex intersections of race, place, and power in northern U.S. cities during the mid 20th century. As a methodology, Black Rhetorical Citizenship uncovers both the Black agency and Black solidarity of residents during urban renewal. I also wanted to make sure that the African Americans remained center at the dialogue of their own displacement and were not overshadowed by those conducting the displacement. I would often find when reading about urban renewal, the story was often told from the top down, and the later story of the tragic effects, but there was nothing that was, at least in my research, that was talking about that moment of when the African American community was finding out and was organizing against it. So, with this in mind, BRC, Black Rhetorical Citizenship, seeks to bring average African American citizens out of the shadows to the forefront of rhetorical histories, highlighting rather than hiding their work as complex rhetorical actors in leading roles in the narratives of their own lives. Such histories are crucial for honoring the legacies of people like Milwaukee's Lucinda Gordon or St. Paul's Tim Howard, or of course Frankie Pace in Pittsburgh. Lucinda Gordon argued, quote, "I was part of a generation that helped break down barriers for African Americans so they could reach their full potential. And I stood on those shoulders who came before me," end quote. I believe that this book's focus on citizenship can inform both our teaching and our pedagogy, especially to those first generation college students, single parents, and laid off workers. These are the voices that often get overlooked as subjects in scholarship. But more importantly, they are the audience for this project. They too can be leaders without having to be a Martin Luther King Jr. or a Barbara Jordan. So when we teach argumentation in our first year writing classes or our first year communication classes, we should point to examples in the Black freedom movement where ordinary people could make a difference. What we see in the actions of African American residents of Milwaukee, St. Paul, and Pittsburgh is what we hope students would do when faced with a similar type of situation. Thank you, and I will now take your questions. I think you're muted, Jennifer.
There it is.
Okay.
All right, thanks, Eric. I'll just talk away. I just wanted to remind everyone to put your questions in the chat. We have a few. I'll start with audience member who wanted you to comment on the influence of Robert Moses, the power broker, on cities other than New York City, which he thoroughly refashioned. Thoughts on Moses?
Actually, I do not have any thoughts on
No,
Moses. I am very well of Robert Moses, and I'm also very well of helping, reading the books that talk about him. And I forget the name of the author who wrote about urban renewal. in New York. But as I was saying, um, I'm very curious about those African American residents in New York. What were their thoughts about Moses during that time?
Mhm.
But of course, very influential. And I think not too long ago there was a Broadway play um, um, produced about the life of Robert Moses.
Okay, now moving to the contemporary moment. Um, an audience member wondered if there were other community organizations focused on these topics, specifically in Milwaukee. Milwaukee Walks and Milwaukee Turner's Jeans Walk come to mind. Any others that you've encountered?
That is a very good question. So, um, more often than not, and let me also preface, Jennifer, that I'm not a historian. So I often had to, kind of learn along the way to doing the archival research.
Mhm.
And what was problematic is, especially for institutional archives, what were available there. A large part of my work was drawing heavily from the Black newspapers.
Mhm.
I can't think of on top of my head of, I'm quite sure there were other city and neighborhood organizations, but I wrote about what the archives provided me in terms of the organizations that I did find. Like for instance, in Milwaukee, I often didn't see anything about Waco, um, but it was only through some of the other archives that I became more aware, and the articles about them in the black newspapers, which also led me to locations in, for lack of a better term, a place you wouldn't necessarily look when thinking about urban renewal. So I'm sure that there were other organizations, and that's one of the things now when I think about protests, when I think about folks who are organizing, and a lot of this stuff now is done digitally and within social media is trying to capture those artifacts that were created and make sure they're being saved and uh, so folks can review them, so scholars can review them at a later date. So maintaining and keeping those um, for the archives.
Right, we have a comment here. Someone was disappointed. There's not much info in the archives, and so thanks for bringing
Well,
that to light.
yeah, so I have to give a shout out to what had helped me um with some of the MA theses that were written previously that kind of helped me with my approach. But again, because I'm trying to center the Black voice, uh, Black church archives were being helpful, both in Rondo and Pittsburgh and Milwaukee. There were these oral histories from folks who were participating, and I used those to help direct me to where to look, as their memories and recalling those events. So so we can't just use the library archives or you know thinking more broadly as far as um, archival research.
Okay. One thing that I was interested in this talk is how you centralize the involvement of the university. I think this can connect to the question about community organization. It seemed as though the university took a central role, both in educating students, but also gathering community members.
Well, I want to push back just a little bit. I want to
Okay,
push
good.
back.
I'm bringing it up there.
uh, you know, um, uh, this was just one part of the book that I was talking about,
Mhm.
and in the chapters. Um, but again, when I'm going to university archives, UW Milwaukee, um, the Minnesota Historical Society, the Wisconsin Historical Society. What is there? And I actually did research at Marquette. Their faculty, their faculty bios and things like that. And so I'm able to see some of these things. So, but what's important to me, especially in the case of Milwaukee, that it was these in the case of Milwaukee, it was the local chapter of the Urban League,
Mhm.
as well as another community organization, the North Side Inventory. I forget the acronym. And there's other organizations, the Organization of Organizations. I want to make sure that when we think about it, it wasn't like the faculty just decide, hey, we're going to do this. This was community driven.
Mhm.
This was the community reaching out to these faculty members saying, hey, this is what we need. Not what it is that you want to do, but this is what we need, and this is how you can help us, which I think is key to any sort of community work. And I'm getting a little preachy here, so please forgive me. I tell that to my students all the time. We can't just come into the community and say this is what we want to do, and we're here to save you. No, it's listening to the community and helping them with whatever their goals may be.
Right. And that's a real lesson for the position of universities in teaching. And you end with thinking about course syllabi and what we can do for our students.
Right.
Okay, a couple more comments and questions here. Wondering how or in what ways groups such as the Black Panthers or Black nationalist groups more
Yes.
really helped with urban renewal.
Yes. Um, as many of the folks who are on this call know, when you're working on a project, especially, this began in graduate school and working in the PhD, my scope was so large. I was going from 1956 to 1974, and I think I could have probably taken a that deeper scope if I was just focusing on one city, which really initially began with just Pittsburgh. But every city has such a deep history. But what I touch on just a little bit, because Pittsburgh and Milwaukee and St. Paul, as well as Minneapolis, are smaller cities. I think the divide between this notion of civil rights and Black power was less, and urban renewal, was going to affect everyone, whether you're more in the camp of um, Martin Luther King, or Stokely Carmichael, or the Panther movement. There were folks who, and I'm thinking specifically in Pittsburgh, that were um, probably more in line with some of the attitudes with the civil rights movement, but then later became more part of the Black Panther movement and Power movement. And um, in my opening slide where I have that billboard, I discuss how the stance was taking a different tone, as opposed to sitting down with city officials and trying to negotiate and argue. It was this more of this direct tone to saying, hey, you will not build past this point. So you kind of see over change of time the tone of resistance changed based off the time. But a big part of my book was in that 50s, mid 50s time frame. And
Mhm.
if I can just say this one thing that I like to bring my students, we're talking about 50, 55, 56. This is the very beginning of what is known about the civil rights movement. The Montgomery bus boycott was still going on during that time when Reverend Davis is standing in his doorway with a shotgun. So I tend to chastise my students a little bit that says you know more about local Selma and Birmingham history than you do about the civil rights history here in Milwaukee.
Mhm. Another question here. To what extent do these communities invoke or deploy their identities as workers in their fight for the city? To what extent was the labor movement involved for good or perhaps for ill?
Absolutely.
Mhm.
Absolutely. Again, making those choices in which to write about in Pittsburgh. Let me talk about Pittsburgh. Um, the labor movement was definitely involved because here you are, you're tearing down the lower hill and you're building this arena, and they didn't even have black workers. I mean, it just add more to, and there were protests leading there that says, hey, you're tearing down these communities, and we're not even part of the workforce. So even then, where this majority black space was not only becoming a majority white space, even the people who were building it were all white. And um, this time is robust, and they're all connected in each of these cities. We could talk about the protest to desegregate the schools, which of course is tied to housing. So there were definitely interconnected, um, and but I just had to make choices on which I was going to write about for the book.
Mhm. Okay, so how do you think we can support these types of organizations today? What terms are helpful in discourse to reference these significant historical events in their relation to modern struggles? Like, how do we get people to activate what we learned in the past now?
I think yes, I think number one is to be present, and I think we have to listen. And and anyone who teach classes or involved in any sort of community engagement or things, one of the things that we talk about and think about, there has to be a trust has to be present, and in these issues and that are affecting whatever community, they're long range issues, and they're complex problems. And as I tell my students who are thinking about projects, they don't correspond to a semester, right, or an academic year. But the big thing is developing and trust that you're present, and that you're be there, and you're going to be there, to help. And for me personally, to think about what are the as an academic and as a scholar, what are the tools and things that I can bring, to help whatever their goals are. And so that's kind of like my approach, and to way I'm thinking it, but trust is the number one thing, and to be present.
Right, and alliances take time.
Alliances take time.
Yeah,
Alliances take time.
yeah. Quick question, if the room size community map, which sounded amazing in
Wasn't
Pittsburgh,
it amazing?
yeah, right, like, does that exist somewhere today?
You know what? I have been on a hunt to find it, and I actually had a phone conversation with Troy West before he passed, and he is known in the architectural community about doing this on the ground and community architecture, and he had won some awards. Uh, the, the so I don't know if it still exists, and if so, I don't know where. But someone told me that it was rolled up and was in someone's garage. So I
Yeah,
started going down that path, trying to find it, but I haven't been able to find it.
okay. Yeah, that thing looked amazing and
It
big
looked
too.
amazing.
So
Yes,
yeah,
yes, definitely amazing.
hopefully it's somewhere and someone didn't
Right,
trash
right.
it. We have a few minutes left, so I wondered, Derek, if you could talk a little bit or introduce your project that you're working on with Professor bonds in mapping racism
Absolutely.
resistance?
So, mapping racism and resistance in Milwaukee County is a digital humanities project, a community engaged project, where folks are helping us to identify and transcribe the covenants, these racist covenants that was prevalent in Milwaukee County. The bulk of them were the 1920s. And when the project is complete, we're going to have a website where you'll be able to see where in Milwaukee County, uh, where these properties, where these covenants were, um, and um, you'll be able to be on a map, and you can actually look at the address and then able to see what the covenant says. And a covenant is whenever you're buying a house, is these things that you can and cannot do in the neighborhood. Your fence can only be this high, the garage can only be this wide. But there was this language where they says, you cannot sell your house to a black person, or only members of the white race can live here. So we're in that process. You can email me if you would like to be a part of that. I think right now we have had over 6,000 volunteers through our virtual platform, Zooniverse, to help transcribe it. And we're about 85% complete. So we need more transcriptions to complete the project. I also want to mention, you see, I got my product display behind me.
Yes.
Ann and I have a book chapter that was recently published in a book called Rhetorical Economies of Whiteness. I think we're chapter 2 or 3 in the book that talk about this language, talk about the language that is displayed in these covenants, and how race in some ways is imbued materially in these suburban communities. Um, so yes, so that's the project I'm working on,
Okay. And
or we're working on.
any plans to expand beyond? I know you're going to hate this question, to expand beyond
No,
Milwaukee County, not yet. Going to stick to
we have we have been
Dane County. No.
we have discussed it. We have discussed perhaps, and this has been an ongoing project that at least 4 or 5 years, and that we have talked about it. Waukesha, I
Mhm.
think there was some interest in Green Bay County, um, Dane County. There are some folks who, or the county, I think the county government themselves are starting to do that. I saw something recently where they're going around to different public libraries to talk about the racial covenants
Mm.
in Dane County. So
Mhm.
um, so yes, and this is not just here in Wisconsin. Other cities and other places are doing it as well.
Mhm. And I know you and recently won a NEH Digital Humanities grant, so congrats on that as
Oh, thank you.
well. Yeah.
Appreciate that.
So I think we have covered all of the questions from our audience. I want to thank you, Derek, for a really thought-provoking lecture, and also just tell everyone to stay tuned for the next faculty UW System faculty lecture, which I believe will be hosted by UW-Madison Center for the Humanities. And we're thinking next semester on that. So stay tuned. But thank you all for joining us, and thank you again, Derek.
Thanks, and thanks everyone for coming out on this Friday. Stay warm out there.
Yeah. All right. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.